Welcome to the Retirement Guy Podcast with Gary Alden from the Kingwood Investment Group. In this podcast, we educate people in or near retirement so they can make informed decisions and bridge the confidence gap. Learn how to mitigate risk in retirement so you don't run out of money before you run out of you. Join Gary Alden and explore strategies on how to live a stress-free retirement.
Hello and welcome to the Retirement Guy with Gary Alden from Kingwood Investment Group. Today we're talking about beneficiaries and TOD. Good morning, Gary. How are you?
We are just fine, Eric. And yourself?
Doing fantastic. Now, you sent me a few notes here and you said we're going to be talking about beneficiaries and TODs. What are TODs?
TOD stands for transfer on death.
Okie dokie. And that has to do
So
with
it's similar
beneficiaries.
to a beneficiary.
Yeah.
Not exactly, but very similar. It pretty well accomplishes the same thing. And we'll get into that more in depth.
All right. Sounds good. Before we do you have something to stump me with, a trivia question or something?
Yes, we do. We have a trivia question for you. I've never heard this before.
All right.
I watch a lot of documentaries. I'm one of those dull, boring guys. My idea is to get on the History Channel and watch documentaries. Mm-hmm. Drives my wife crazy. But anyway, it's what I do. That's what I like doing. But I heard a term this weekend, and the term was smooth operator. I think we've always heard the term smooth operator. Mm-hmm. You know, Eric Johnson is a smooth operator.
Gary, I can say I've probably never heard that before.
Where did the term smooth operator come from?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had anybody call me a smooth operator. And just
not even your wife, Eric?
No, not really.
No?
Not necessarily that terminology. No, I would say that one of the first times I ever heard the term probably was from Sade, which is a singer, and she sang the song "Smooth Operator," she's absolutely a beautiful voice and love that. But I'm pretty sure it's from before that. And I think it has to do with the switchboard, but that's just a kind of a general guess, and we'll leave the answer to the end. But I think it has to do with somebody on the switchboard that had to, plug in those wires and unplug them and change them and all that jazz. So, but we'll talk about that at the end, right?
There you go.
Okay.
So, when you talk about beneficiaries, you're really talking about, hey, I'm dead. I'm not here anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm naming a beneficiary. Well, the most common place, people name beneficiary is, in their will or their trust document. But also you have beneficiaries that you would name in your IRA account, your 401k account, your insurance policies, your annuity policies that you might have. So when you do name a beneficiary, it bypasses or supersedes your will. So let's say, Eric, you said in your will, I want everything in the world to go to my wife, but you had one, say, little bank account out there, and it had the designation of TOD, transfer on death, to your cousin Fred. Well, even though your will says everything goes to your sweet, lovely wife, if you had an account that you had set up years ago and kind of forgot about how it was titled, and it said transfer on death to your cousin Fred's going to get the money.
Really? I did not know that.
So it supersedes your will just like a beneficiary form does. So again, I had this happen years ago. I had a gentleman came in. He was actually an airline pilot, and we were opening a new account for him. And I just happened to mention to him, I says, because he mentioned he had just gotten married. I said, so do you have your new wife as beneficiary in your 401k plan, where he worked at one of the airlines? And he says, well, I really have my old wife as beneficiary, but I have a new will and I've named my new wife as my beneficiary, so she would get my 401k plan. And I explained to him, no. Whatever the beneficiary form says, that's who's going to get the money. So if you've made the mistake or haven't reviewed your beneficiaries in a while, which you should do every year or so, his ex-wife was going to get that money. So I told him your new wife might be a little upset if your 401k plan, which is where, majority of his money was going to get that money. So it behooves everybody periodically sit down and do it, look at old forms and stuff. We have people all the time find stuff. We review their beneficiaries, especially on annuities and old insurance policies. Maybe they had their children on there or their brother or their sister. Now that brother or sister is deceased, hey, you need to get that stuff up to date.
Yeah, that's very surprising that the most recent directive, if you will, I don't know if that's the proper terminology, but you go and make your will, a week ago, and that doesn't trump the beneficiary plan that you wrote out 30 years ago from your company 401k or whatever. That's very strange.
Yep, it is. And there's a famous court case on beneficiaries on a guy. He had a 401k plan, and he had his wife as beneficiary. Then his wife passed away. Mm-hmm. He got remarried, and this is actually a very, very famous court case because it went to court. He got remarried, but he never put his new wife as beneficiary. Then he passed away. But before he passed away, his second wife passed away. So it got back to the first wife was on the beneficiary form, even though she was dead and he had been remarried. He never had any children from either marriage. However, his second wife had 2 sons. Well, the 401k plan, they had a formula that the plan used, not the courts, that the plan used, and they said the money went to like his siblings. Well, the kids, which were his stepchildren, sued and say, no, we were the kids of his second wife. We're sure he would want us to have the money. It went to the courts, went to tax court, and the courts ruled that the IRS plan, not the IRS, but the 401k plan rules, what they said determined who got the money.
Wow.
So sometimes when probably he did marry this lady, and maybe he did want his stepchildren to get the money, but he didn't put it in writing. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's important to keep up with all this stuff, and that's why we're talking today. So, and one thing, when you do talk about beneficiaries, you kind of have to bring up probate, and all probate is you have a will, and, a will is just saying, where do you want your stuff to go when you pass away? Mm-hmm. And you're going to name your beneficiaries in there. And you've got to remember that when you do name your beneficiaries, if they passed away, let's say you named, I want my 3 kids to have the money. If only 2 are still alive by the time the will is probated, that money is going to be split 50-50, unless you have a provision in your will saying you want that, even though your son has passed away, you want that money to say go to the grandkids, then you got to have to remember and put that in the will. That's why you need to sit down with a good legal professional.
Absolutely.
And by the way, Eric, everything we're talking about here today is in general, and you should always, always consult a legal professional before you do any of these things. We talk about this on our podcast here to make sure it's applicable in your situation, and also it's applicable under your particular state laws that you live in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because everything we're talking about is in general. So, again, you're going to have a beneficiary on your will and should review that periodically. You're going to have beneficiary on your IRA account, 401k account, an insurance policy, an annuity. Those things all name beneficiaries, and they supersede your will. So, again, if your will says all my money goes to my wife, but your insurance policy says all your money goes to your first wife's going to get the money, not your second wife.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But what I want to spend a little bit of time on, and really the main reason we're kind of doing this podcast on this subject is in the last couple of weeks, I've had several questions from clients about beneficiary designations, and also if they should take, say, their bank account and call it a TOD. Because when you have a bank account, there's no such thing as a beneficiary as such.
Okay.
But you can designate the account. You have to change the titling on the account to a TOD, transfer on death. And transfer on death accounts, they're trying to keep your estate planning intact, and also they're trying to keep your beneficiaries out of court. So, if you've done your job and done all your titling right, it's going to be a lot easier on the kids and the family when you do pass away. And you want to avoid probate and the cost of going to court. My idea is not to put some attorney's kids through college because I messed up or didn't do stuff while I was alive.
Exactly.
So again, a TOD account can avoid a big legal mess by moving your assets without leaving them in your will. So exactly what is a TOD account? So a transfer on death, TOD account, automatically transfers the assets to the person, in effect, the beneficiary. So they don't call it a beneficiary, but it really is a beneficiary. It's who you want the money transferred to on death.
Yep.
So we'll just use the term beneficiary to make it easy for everybody listening.
Perfect.
So, for example, Eric, let's say you had a savings account over at the local savings and loan, and you said, I've got $100,000 in there, and if I pass away, I want my son to have that money.
Mm-hmm.
So even though your will says everything I own in the world goes to your wife, that $100,000 is not going to go to your wife because the TOD supersedes the will.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes clients want to do that. I have a client right now that all of her assets, and she has a lot of assets, go to her 3 children. However, we have one account out there designated, and it goes to, and she has something like 10 or 12 grandkids. And that one account is separated out away from her children. And that one account, she says, I want that to go to my grandkids directly.
Nice.
And also you want to make sure, and in her case, they are all older. You want to make sure when you do name somebody as a beneficiary, make sure their age of majority, in other words, 18 or older, because a minor cannot really inherit money. So then you get into setting up trusts and all kinds of legal stuff. So that's when you sit down with an attorney and make sure you've got all your designations right and everybody's at the correct age.
Got it.
So again, a brokerage account. Let's say you've got a brokerage account down at the XYZ brokerage firm, and you've got a bunch of stocks and bonds in there. Your will could say everything I own goes to, my wife. And your brokerage account, let's say the brokerage account was strictly in my name, then your wife's going to have to show up with paperwork. Here's a death certificate and sign a bunch of pieces of paper and all that to get that money. And eventually she could get it. But you could really, really speed things along by just naming your wife as TOD, transfer on death, or maybe what you really want to do is add your wife's name on the titling of the account so it's a jointly held account.
Got it.
So just, now again, everything we're talking about here, and you get into estate planning, can vary by state. And also, sometimes different banks have different rules on what they will do at their particular bank. So again, everything we're talking about here in general. So sometimes your bank may not go along with you on what you exactly want to do because they want to do it their way, not necessarily your way. This is one of the questions I had from one of my clients. They said, can I have several people on a TOD account named to get that money? In other words, beneficiary on the TOD account. And the answer is yes. You could have multiple people. They also asked me this question. I haven't heard this one in a long time. They want to leave part of their money to their favorite charity. And I told them, I said, yeah, you can leave it to a charity, but you don't want to just name the charity, say the Red Cross. Well, there could be Red Cross, maybe different Red Cross chapters. I don't know how Red Cross works, but you always want to get the tax ID number if you're naming an entity. Same way if you're naming your church, get that church's tax ID number or get the charity's tax ID number. So that's included in the paperwork. So there's no mistaking, you say, I want this to go to the Baptist church. Well, which Baptist church?
Yeah, exactly.
So get their tax ID number, because we ran into that a few years ago. One of our clients, and really part of the problem was us. We had put down the name of an entity as her beneficiary, and our client passed away. But in the entity on our paperwork, all we had was the name and no tax ID number. So we had to jump through a lot of hoops to make sure. Now, we knew who she wanted the money to go to, but it caused a bunch of work on our end. And also, it was a charity on the charity, and we finally got it straightened out. But again, you get in the legalese, and when money's involved, things can happen.
Absolutely.
Now, again, a TOD account versus a will, we've kind of already talked about this this morning, and that, again, estate planning, the whole purpose you do estate planning is to minimize the legal mess that you might leave after you pass away. Because without it, the probate system of whatever state you're in can take over the distribution, or they will take over the distribution of your assets. And, of course, in a will, you can name an executor, somebody that's going to make sure the money is divided up the way you want it to go, and also maybe pay off any debts you have when you pass away. And then the executor is then going to distribute what's left to your beneficiaries according to your last will and testament. I want a certain amount of money to go here, here, whatever. And if you don't do things properly and it ends up in probate court, the money may not go where you want it to go. It may go, we mentioned Cousin Fred a few minutes ago. It may go to Cousin Fred, and you don't even like Cousin Fred.
Exactly.
But because you didn't do your homework in setting up a will, and only roughly about 57% of the people in the United States have a will. So that means 43% of the people in the United States, they either don't have a will or they don't have a proper will. And I think we've mentioned this before on previous podcasts. Texas is one of the 9 community property states. So if you come into Texas with a will that doesn't conform to the community property laws of the state of Texas, yeah, you've got a will, but it doesn't work in Texas and you die in Texas.
Ouch.
In fact, you may not even have a will. You think you have a will, but you don't have one per the state of Texas. So that's why anytime anybody listening on the podcast, you ever change your state of residency, you always want to get with an attorney. Don't pass go, don't collect $200. As soon as you get in that new state, find an attorney and see if your will, all your legal documents are going to pass muster in your new state. And then if they won't, hey, get them changed as quickly as possible. Because again, all you're doing is creating a legal mess. And it's kind of like, pay me now or pay me later. So pay the attorney now when you're alive and well to get all this stuff lined up the way you want it. Because if you pass away and things are a big mess, you're going to pay the attorney. But now you're paying the attorney a lot more money. Again, probate, getting back to TODs, again, a TOD skips the probate process, takes precedence over a will, but if you do have a TOD account naming your brother as a beneficiary on account and your will says everything goes to, say, your children, again, your brother is going to get that money. I can't emphasize that enough because over the years we have seen things like that happen, and we have seen parts of family not talking to other parts of family.
Yeah.
Because they start squabbling over money.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, it's got to be a very stressful situation. Gary, let me ask you a question. What kind of accounts can you put a TOD on? You've covered bank accounts and obviously credit union. I would put those in the same category. Can you do TOD on anything else?
Yeah, like your brokerage account.
Yeah. I mean, you can do, instead of beneficiary, you can actually set it up as TOD.
Right.
Wow.
I have a gentleman in another state. He's never been married, never had kids. And so and we have his brokerage account. And on his brokerage account, he has actually a set of twins, 2 girls, and his 2 nieces are on his account, on his TOD account. So if something happens to him, his 2 nieces will divide up that money in the brokerage account. And then he does have an annuity contract with us. So on the annuity, they are named as beneficiaries, and the 2 nieces are going to get that money also. So the 2 nieces are going to have a fistful of dollars
good.
Someday. But remember, this is one reason you want to periodically, you need to review these to make sure, hey, is everybody still alive that you've named on here? Do you need to make some changes? Or every once in a while, we do have this happen. We had one of our clients. He came in one day, maybe a year and a half or so ago, and he came in and he had, I'm trying to remember, he has multiple, his kids are very, very well off. He is literally not leaving a dime to his kids, and the kids understand that. So he's bypassing the kids, and all the money's going to the grandkids.
Nice.
So very, very nice grandpa. But apparently somebody upset him because he came in there and he took one of the grandkids off his beneficiary list.
Uh-oh.
And that's going to cost that one grandkid about $450,000.
Oh, boy. Yep.
So I don't know what the grandkid did. I don't ask questions. He just came in and said, I want to take one of the grandkids off and divide the rest of the money between the rest of the grandkids. And we said, yes, sir.
Yes,
and
sir.
we don't ask questions at that point.
Gotcha. All right.
We just leave that, we leave that to them. So let's kind of look at some of this we've kind of already talked about before, but a TOD account will prevent you from compiling additional debt through probate because of maybe having to have attorney's fees in there. But you cannot erase an estate's debt with a TOD.
Okay.
Creditors can still go after assets in a TOD account. And tax collectors can also, the federal courts could come after you for estate tax. But again, you've got to have, right now the estate tax exemption, I think, is over $11 million. So the average person's probably never going to have an estate tax due. And also, TOD accounts are also subject to potentially an inheritance tax because certain states do have inheritance taxes. Also, there might be capital gains taxes, as well as taxes on withdrawals from pre-tax investments, including IRAs, 401k plans. So again, you want to make sure your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed. But again, when somebody does pass away, the tax man cometh. Now, how about a pitfall of a TOD account? So while a TOD account can be divided among several beneficiaries, that doesn't mean it has to be divided equally. You may want to consult with the beneficiaries, maybe your financial advisor, to avoid any potential conflicts. So let's say I might have a TOD account with, say, 3 people as, quote, beneficiaries on there, but maybe I want one person to get 50%, one person to get 40%, and one person to get 10%. And again, make for sure everybody that you name on your TOD account is at least 18 years or older, or it could be an issue because minors cannot control investment accounts.
Got it.
So kind of summing all this up today, Eric, when your family is grieving, and I see literally I had a quick phone call right before we talked today that I have a lady, she called up very unexpectedly. Her husband is 49 years old and passed away totally unexpected.
Oh, man.
And she is definitely grieving, and she had some questions to me. But, when your family is grieving, complex estate planning can just complicate everybody's lives even more. So luckily for her, and they'd only been married, I think she said about 6 or 7 years, they had done a will together. And that was great. And he had changed all the beneficiaries. And one of the big things, and she mentioned to me, he literally had $1.5 million life insurance policy that had his previous wife's name on the beneficiary, and he had taken previous wife's name on and put her name on. And she mentioned that to me. She said, so I will be getting that. But one of her questions she did have, she said, hey, Gary, am I going to pay taxes on that $1.5 million life insurance policy? And I said, absolutely not.
No, yeah.
There is no income tax ever on an insurance policy. Never is there federal income tax on an insurance policy. However, if the insurance policy was big enough, there could be a state tax on an insurance policy. In her case, it's not. Again, if the insurance policy is too big, you could owe estate taxes, but you'll never pay federal income tax on life insurance.
Gotcha.
But you do have the chance of paying federal estate tax or estate tax, depending on the state you live.
All right.
So anyway, that covers everything I wanted to cover today. So hopefully maybe you got a little bit smarter, maybe our listeners got a little bit smarter. And again, I hope everybody got what I was trying to get across today, the importance of making sure all these designations are up to date so your money goes to where you want it to go in a timely fashion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Gary, thank you so much. And now it's time to give us the answer to that trivia question.
Well, I told you I like to watch documentaries. So this last weekend, I was watching a documentary on Andrew Carnegie, and he became a in today's terms, he would be a multi-billionaire.
Oh, wow.
In the steel industry. I don't think we had billionaires back then, but if you take it in today's dollars, he was one of, probably the 4 or 5 richest Americans at one time. And he started out very, very humble beginnings. I mean, this man, he was not handed a bunch of money. Very, very humble beginnings, but one of the jobs he had before he became a steel magnate, he had a job, like Thomas Edison had a job, as being a telegraph operator. And if you had a good touch on the telegraph key, you were known as a smooth operator. You knew how to operate the telegraph smoothly, and he was known as a smooth operator, so he was in high demand as a telegraph operator.
Wow.
So Andrew Carnegie started out, Thomas Edison, they both had one thing in common. As they were growing up, they learned how to be telegraph operators. And I don't think that occupation is in demand anymore.
Not so much.
No, not so much.
Yeah.
So anyway, so smooth operator, that means you were a smooth operator on the telegraph.
All right. Well, thank you, Gary, for your time. This was a very informative podcast, not only about the smooth operator, but the TOD subject was fascinating to me. So I think that's something that everybody needs to hear because I would have assumed that you write a will and that's that's locking it down. But no, that's not the case. TODs will supersede a will, and that's very important information. So thanks again, Gary. And thank you all for listening to the Retirement Guy podcast with Gary Alden. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Gary comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at Kingwood Investment Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Retirement Guy podcast. Click the subscription button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Kingwood Investment Group. The content has been made available for information and education purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions that you may have regarding your investment planning. Kingwood Investment Group is independent of Next Financial Group, Inc. Securities and investment advisory services offered through Next Financial Group, Inc., member FINRA/SIPC.